Hello all and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. Today we're picking up Metroid Monday where we left off last week, which was the defeat of Gandrayda. Now we did get the newest grapple ability, that which allows you to charge and or take charge or recharge objects around as a lock and key system. And that's about it. At the moment, we're kind of in a little bit of a, shall we say, a difficult part of the game. We are at a point where progression is going to be limited by certain side abilities and tools. This being, of course, at the moment, the magnet ball, or the spider ball, and the hazard shield. Now, we need one to get the other. So we're going to be taking a brief trip back to the ship, do a little bit of meandering, see if we can get a couple upgrades, and then head off to, I believe, Elysia. Now, if I remember correctly, one of the power stations in Elysia has what we seek, a singular upgrade. And of course, this one singular upgrade is going to be the spider ball, with the goal being traversal. Get a couple new upgrades while we're there, a couple missile tanks, and then come back to the pirate homeworld and use said upgrade to get more. That's kind of the general loop of how this game works, right? Every single region has locks and keys. You need to get through a red shield door, you use the plasma beam. A white shield door, you use the ice missiles. A gray shield, you just need missiles in general. A cracked plate on the ground, well, you might need to use just standard bombs. Regardless of what it is, there's always a piece of Samus's toolkit that is necessary or useful as far as building up the player's capability and Samus's unique power. The point, I suppose, that needs to be brought up regarding that is that Samus has always been a character designed around lock and key logic, even as far back as the oldest and original games. This makes for... Wow, I just fell down an elevator shaft. Well, that's it, guys. Game over. Anyways, this leads to Samus being gated behind certain barriers earlier on in a game, and these barriers opening up as the player becomes more familiar with Samus's toolkit, but also as Samus's toolkit continues to expand. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is because in some of the older games, looking at the original or Super Metroid, a lot of the gateways, or a lot of the gating in the game itself was about just having the tool for the job. You could theoretically go to Area A or Area B, or through half of, well, let's make this a bit more specific. You can go through half of Ridley's stage without necessarily having the right beam weapon, and having to turn around to get a new beam to use that later down the line. Now, in some cases, this could be something like needing the ice beam, or just needing a extra couple missiles to break down a shield door or something. Whatever it ends up being that Samus or the player needs, it always reflects back on the world as a whole. Now, in the older games, when you were limited by stuff like ammunition, there was usually an endless supply of enemies that allowed you to just take them down quick and get your upgrades, not upgrades, get your ammunition, and off you went to the races. But the further into the franchise you go, the less that specific ammunition became a necessity. looking at games like Super Metroid, where it wasn't really as big of a concern. Well, yes, you still, I believe, needed 5 missiles to get through certain shield doors. You always had more than enough, and a skilled player could easily break the game, so to speak, in order to get to places that otherwise would be inaccessible. This is one of the fundamental rules of Metroid as a whole. Well, that didn't work. So that's 2 Samus kill count today. The last 5 minutes, holy smokes. But when you get into the Prime trilogy, it becomes much more notable that Samus has room to grow, but the locks that are in place are a lot harder to get through without the appropriate gear. I'm going to use the Frigate Orpheon's second trip through as an example. You are effectively in a situation where you need to get from A to B. Your access to the Phazon mines is on the other side of the Frigate Orpheon, and the Frigate Orpheon is submerged. Therefore, your best, I suppose, course of action is to find the gravity suit, which is in Phendrana Drifts, and then head back to the Frigate Orpheon and use that option to get through. Now, my first attempt playing through Metroid Prime, I ended up going through the entire Frigate Orpheon to the very bottom of the shaft where the reactor core was, before I found out that I had to go somewhere completely different. And I ended up spending, I think it was a good 2 hours, just trying to climb back out of that pit. And so, one of the few times it lets you go somewhere that you clearly are not supposed to go, it ends up being incredibly hard and incredibly difficult to get back. Now, this was at a time when I didn't know the gravity suit existed, which I was playing Metroid Prime, I probably should have, but I didn't know about it. And so I made a judgment and went through with the plan I had in mind to get to where my next goal was, or theoretically was. This is all to say that in Prime 3, it follows many of the same rules that Prime 1 and 2 did. The difference between 1, 2, and 3 is primarily its rigidity. Oh wow, 3 Samuses. The rigidity I'm talking about in this case is that Metroid Prime 3 is, if anything, more sticky about how the player can progress. In the case of 1, it is more than willing to let you go into places you shouldn't be. Now, you might not be able to get far, but theoretically it will let you go there at any point in time. So, why the issue then? Because Prime 3 gates has, I suppose, I'd say 5 major gates. Each of these gates is a major boss, or major region. So, it feels more like it's aiming to be Prime 2. Prime 1 has a very open-ended design. It will let the player go all the way to the bottom of a chasm to discover that they can't get back, or that they can't go further and have to backtrack. Prime 2 said every single area of the game is important, and you're going to have to complete certain objectives in a certain order to complete said game. Prime 3 took the idea of Prime 2 to a natural extreme, where the player is effectively gated not just by the world itself, by a couple of doors that you need new translations for to get through, but by entire planets that you can't access in any capacity until you have completed the main missions or goals of the prior planet. And so you end up with a situation where every time you try to progress in Prime 1, there's a lot more guesswork to it. Prime 2 and 3 have a lot more, I suppose, what's the word? Scripted or planned out progression for the player? Really? Okay, we're at 4, or is that 5 Samuses now? The progression in Prime 3 is a lot less linear. I think that's easiest, or is a lot more linear. There we go. Hoofty. Words are hard today. It's a lot more linear in that every gateway, every lock that you need to progress throughout the entire game has kind of 2 major facets to it. There are some locks that are like the spider ball, where once you get it, it opens up a whole plethora of pathways, new items, etc. That on older game, you might use something like the infinite bomb jump to access. It's not that the game has changed or that the rules have changed, just that the means of progression have opened up new possibilities. Most keys in this type of game end up being a tool, some means of accessing an area that you otherwise would be incapable of getting to. And I think it's one of the reasons why games like The Legend of Zelda, like Metroid, or even games like Dark Souls and Metroidvanias in general end up being so beloved, in that you get to physically see not just the progression of your character over time, but also the progression of yourself as a player over time. Now, I've been mentioning a lot of different games as of late. And the reality is that no game exists within a vacuum. Every single game has...
I've ordered the Federation fleet to walk to the pirate homeworld and begin the invasion. I think it's time we took the fight to them. We'll contact you when we're ready to commence our assault.
Okay. Anyways, every single area, every single game out there does not exist in a vacuum. There is so much more to gaming, and the references and tools used by one are easily transferable to another. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is because Metroid has learned from itself primarily. Yes, absolutely did the original games try to take a basic idea.
Samus, the Federation Armada is now in orbit above the pirate homeworld. We're ready for the final assault, but the base is protected by a barrier that prevents us from landing. We need you to disable this defense system. Unit 242 has located its control center. Here are the coordinates.
Cool. As I was saying, nothing exists within a vacuum. The original Metroid was meant to be darker and foreboding. It was meant to invoke a feeling of isolation. And that's something that I believe Metroid 1 did incredibly well. Metroid 2, on the other hand, was meant to feel epic. Like there was a grander goal, that there was something more that you were aiming for. And it did this, in part and in many ways, through its use of the dark tones, the atmosphere, and just the fact that you as the player, you as Samus, go through planet SR-388 with the goal of exterminating an entire species. It's not something that should be done, without some level of forethought, but it is something that Samus does because Samus is one of the few people that can. Follow this up with Super Metroid, and Super has this. It's more. I don't want to say it's more triumphant. I'd rather say that it is a game that feels suffocating at times, where the player has to learn to lean on themselves, where progression is often gated behind. How do I want to put it? Progression for me, was gated behind circumstances that I ordinarily wouldn't put myself through. And I think that's something that makes Super Metroid unique among games, is that there was a plan. There was more to it than just, hey, we are going to make you do, or we are going to try to invoke this feeling of fear or this feeling of isolation. More than anything, I found that Super Metroid was... it made you feel powerful in ways that I don't think that very many games ever did. When I played Super Metroid, I always felt like I was in control of the situation. Sure, there was more to it than just being in control or more than just feeling strong. It had more to do with the fact that this world that I had learned about, had played through games in the form of the original of Zero Mission, and turned around and go back. I had a level of understanding, but I didn't have a full grasp of what I was getting into with it. I think that's feeling of discovery, that feeling of I did that, I can go here or whatnot, definitely helped with my experience of Super. But then you have games like Prime and Fusion. Now, for me, Prime 1 and Fusion are polar opposites, where Fusion was meant to make you feel isolated and invoke fear in the form of dealing with the great and terrifying monster that was the SAX. Prime felt more freeform, felt more open-ended, felt more of like Discovery. In some way, shape, or form, it was greatly influenced by what came before it in the form of Super Metroid. Now, I don't want to get it twisted. Super Metroid and Prime are very different games. But where Super didn't always... For me, Super missed the mark a couple times. Whereas Prime felt fantastic, felt powerful, felt like so much more. But it couldn't... Super Metroid walked where I felt Prime 1 could run. What happened, though, is that each subsequent game in the trilogy took what it learned from the prior game. Metroid Prime 1 had more freeform world building, had the 12 keys, and this all worked wonders for Prime 1. But then they took that mentality and said, this little aspect over here, the hunt, could be expanded on. And so they took Prime 2's artifact tiles and made it bigger, made it harder. But they also made it more unique in that you effectively had to find the key twice. Every single key had to be found twice. The first time you had to find a Luminoth or a soldier in the light world, scan them to get an idea of what it would be or where the key would be, and then return to that location in the dark world to find and access said key. And even then, they were still guarded by monsters or creatures in that new world, in that new environment. Prime 3 looked at the world building structure of Prime 1 and said that's too freeform. They wanted something that was more, I don't want to say scripted. I want to say more controlled. And I think part of that comes down to the fact that Prime 3 was built with accessibility in mind. It was the first Metroid for the Nintendo Wii. And I don't want to get it wrong here, but the Nintendo Wii was designed primarily for an audience that otherwise wouldn't necessarily look towards Metroid. Prime 3, for everything it does great, and for all of its flaws, was built for a demographic that ordinarily wouldn't play Metroid. And that's kind of the hardest part of this whole discussion and dissection of this game, is that it is more linear than most other Metroids will ever be. By design, it was built with the hint system in mind so that no player would be lost for too long. It was built to feel more cinematic because of what was happening around it in the form of games like Halo. It was built to be more than its predecessors, but also built to be more streamlined, more focused than the games that came before it. And this is both one of its greatest strengths, being the more cinematic approach, and one of its bigger weaknesses. As I said, that Prime 1 and 2, each game got more focused in how they wanted the player to progress. And that's kind of one of the beautiful things about each game going forward, is that where Prime 1 was open-ended, Prime 2 and 3 got much more focused, much more, you go to an area, you get to learn, you get to grow along with your space. And that, I think, is something that not many games get right. So often I see games focus on too big or too small a scope. If you look at, I'm gonna point a finger here at another game that I am actively making videos on, Zelda Breath of the Wild. Zelda Breath of the Wild was meant to be everything that the other Zeldas had been and more. It was meant to take the idea of a Zelda and break the mold, change effectively everything about what Link's core character would do and be capable of. Now, in the older games, like the original, this free-form mentality was perfect for that type of game. They built a world and said, have fun, figure it out. And for a lot of players, myself included, with the original, I found myself wandering aimlessly for a large majority of the game. Breath of the Wild looked at the mentality of the player, looked at the world of Zelda, and asked the question of how can we make this bigger or better? And they challenged every single concept of what made a Zelda to currently mixed reviews. While it started out as being one of the most well-acclaimed games in the franchise, and one that the individuals playing it fell in love with and then out of love with after a certain point in time, it was always something that they looked at with this more. They looked at the game and the franchise as a whole, and their goal was always to make the game not fit the molds. Make the game feel more epic, feel more like the grand adventures that they started with. And while that's all well and good, if you look at where I think Metroid is going, I believe that they're aiming to make Metroid Prime 4, admittedly not like, they want to make it more like, I don't believe it's going to be more streamlined. I believe that it is going to be more open-ended. But with each game in Metroid being more cinematic, I can see this new chapter, Prime 4's look into the future, being more about the development of the world, and almost like and as it is a new chapter, I feel like it's going to take a break from characters like the Space Pirates in some capacity and focus in on a new group altogether. In this case, I believe that the Space Pirates are going to be instrumental in the beginning in getting Samus to the end game of where to the main stage of the game, if that makes sense. But they're going to be less involved after reaching the new planets, after getting to the point of Samus being stranded. And I think that's probably the best answer I could give as to what they're looking for. But no developer ever wants to look at a game and say, let's do the same thing as last time and resell it to you. Except maybe Bethesda with Skyrim. But every single developer that has ever made a successful franchise typically has the goal of constantly innovating, growing, building something more than what came before. And while some games, I will admit, have a bit of a identity crisis, or some series kind of stagnate and sell you the same thing one game to the next, generally speaking, I've always found that growth and innovation are what really move most developers. And I think that's a really good thing for a franchise as a whole. Metroid started as something darker and, dare I say, grittier, or potentially even more atmospheric than most of the games of the time. It had big shoes to fill with every future installment. Prime 1, 2, 3, Dread, you name it, they all had big shoes to fill because of the original Metroid. And the thing is that expectations of each game only got more grand as each new game came out. Because after finishing Prime 1, the developers have a better idea of what makes a good Metroid. And so people are going to approach Prime 2 with higher expectations. A fleshed out world, more to the character, and more to explore. And that's honestly an amazing thing that can very rarely be found in other media. And that's probably one of the best things and that could possibly come out of a game franchise is growth. So the reason I bring that up, and in part, is because some franchises tend to stick to the status quo. If you look at, I'm going to point the finger at another Metro, or at another Nintendo franchise, Super Mario. Up until, well, Super Mario 1 and the Lost Levels. Super Mario 1 was meant to be a game. Approachable, they did everything they could to make the game work. Lost Levels was almost identical to Super Mario 1, except soul-crushingly hard. It was meant to be a bigger, badder, harder game than the original ever could be. But they took the franchise and then had Super Mario Bros. 3. Bros. 3 was a reimagining and a reinvention of the Mario Bros. Format and formula. And again, this is a good thing. But by the time you reach newer franchises, we then jump into Super Mario World. We have the new Super Mario Bros. Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. Wii U. We have new Super Mario Bros. DS. And what started as something approachable became mundane, became consistent. It's the same game with new color palette. At least that's how people began to approach it. Prime has never had that issue, and Metroid as a whole has never had that issue. Each game looked at what was around it and said, hey, could we elaborate on it? And I will forever give the developers of the Metroid franchise credit where it's due, because even the spin-off titles and the fan-made projects in the course of games like AM2R all have a very unique, distinct feel to them, something that cannot be said for all franchises. If we stick to a single mentality, a single game feel, we essentially miss out on half of what this particular medium is capable of. In the words of the creator of Mad Max Fury Road, he wanted the movie directed not by himself but by his wife, because if he makes an action movie directed by a man, it would always be just another action movie. But having it directed from a different perspective, from a different point of view, could change the genre as a whole. And that's all to say, we need to continue to improvise, continue to grow, continue to look at the future of video games as a whole, or of a franchise, of a character, and really dial in. It's not always about consistency. Well, I shouldn't say it's not about consistency. It's about knowing that what to tweak. It's about knowing what to tweak. That's the best way of putting it. No two games will ever feel completely alike unless they're made to be the same. If you look at a remake, a remaster, a reimagining, all three of these words effectively mean the same thing in a vacuum. A remake is just taking a game A and saying, okay, cool, here you go, here's your game again. Here's your game again, here's my $80. A remaster takes what was there and makes it more accessible to the modern audiences. How do I want to put this? In Metroid Prime 1, we had the game, and it was fun, and it was atmospheric. It was a fantastic game. It was one that I look back on fondly on typically an annual basis. If you look at Metroid Prime 1 on the remake in the form of the trilogy version, it's the same game with a new coat of paint. It took the original Metroid Prime and updated the control so that the player wasn't kind of stuck with tank controls in what was arguably, we had a newer and, dare I say, more put together control scheme for Prime 3. A control scheme that worked beautifully for Prime 3 for what it was, that could be tweaked to make Prime 1 and 2 work better on the Nintendo Wii. Cool. And then you have the Switch remake. And the Switch remake, honestly, is... I've had a chance to play it. And they went back to the old control scheme of the original Prime, and they created a second control scheme. This in the form of the dual analog, which is more contemporary. They didn't make the game from the ground up. They didn't need to reimagine Talon 4. They took Talon 4 and added more detail, made more depth, made the game continue to feel more like itself. But they gave it a coat of paint that made, admittedly, this is a bit of an embarrassing point, but in the beginning of Prime 1's remaster, I sat down and I just stared in awe. In the beginning, before the Chozo ruins, there's a little tree with a glowing bulb that explodes if hit. And in front of the tree are some grasses and some blue butterflies that are just flittering around because that's what they do. And I was completely mesmerized by this. Not because it's anything groundbreaking or revolutionary, but because it shows and continues to immerse the player in this overarchingly large, grand world. But they took enough care to say, hey, this over here is important. This tiny detail that shows the world as alive as it is. That you can get lost in these small details in and of itself is an achievement. One that I sincerely hope that they continue to show off exactly what they are capable of making. Because ultimately, everything that we create as humanity, as people, should be with the lens of continued growth. Now, I'm not saying that we need to destroy the world in the name of quote-unquote progress, but rather that what was done today might be done better tomorrow. Anyways, if you like what you see, drop a like, leave a sub, and we'll catch you next time.